So I wanted to do a quick presentation on Ellen White and on various issues that keep coming up within the conversation within, from inside and outside the denomination. There's been challenges and problems with Ellen White in the sense of people raising issues with her from the very beginning of the church, and sometimes it was because people disagree with her on theology. So, somebody came to a different conclusion on some theological point than the church did. And then because Ellen White supported the church position, they disagree with her as well. Other times while she was alive, for example, there were leadership issues. So certain church leaders wanted to take things a certain way, was in a certain direction, and she disagreed. And there were, uh, you know, different difficulties in that sense. In more recent history, we had some major controversies regarding Ellen White. So some of the more significant ones are people like Walter Ree came up with the plagiarism charge, where basically he argued that she took a large section of writing from other authors and incorporated them into her writings and took credit for them. And then you have people like Desmond Ford, who basically attacked Ellen White indirectly by basically saying that the fundamental elements of Adventist theology are faulty, and because Ellen White is played a critical role in developing that theology, then her prophetic office is in question as well. So he did not necessarily negate the fact that she was inspired in some sense, but he developed a view of inspiration that is very different than Adventist traditionally viewed inspiration. So these are some of the more major challenges. Now, as far as Ford's arguments regarding the Adventist theology, I have another video on that. I think he made some massive blunders in his approach to the topic. I won't go into that here, but you're welcome to visit my channel and watch the video on Desmond Ford. Now, the issues with Ellen White, they keep popping up. They keep every so often somebody kind of revisits the topic and begins to question Ellen White's various aspects of Ellen White's ministry. So it's kind of a perpetual nuisance on the church. It just seems to create problems that don't go away. Now, for me, the majority of the problems we have with Ellen White have to do with faulty theology of revelation inspiration. And because people don't really understand how inspiration works, at least within the Adventist perspective, they apply that to Ellen White and then have expectations that are unrealistic. And really, there's simple solutions to most of the issues. At least from my point of view, most of the issues that we have with Ellen White that could easily be fixed if we resolve some of these other problems, deeper issues with theology. Okay, so before we discuss Ellen White, we need to take a look at how revelation inspiration works when it comes to Scripture itself. So the context in which I want to think about inspiration is in the context of a sola scriptura theology, and just kind of define that really quick before moving on, because this has a lot to do with the Adventist position, and it affects, depending on what perspective critics are coming from, it affects how they approach the topic. So first of all, when it comes to sola scriptura, we need to realize that the terminology doesn't always mean what it seems to mean. So sola scriptura has been a significant essentially, it's been a label that has been used by Protestant Christianity from its very beginning, but for the most part, within Protestant Christianity, it doesn't really mean what it seems to mean. So at face value, sola scriptura means the Bible alone, and it implies that what we're talking about is a theology that is based on the Bible alone. However, for most Protestants, sola scriptura doesn't mean that. It's actually been modified to mean the Bible plus the early church fathers, the early church tradition, the early church councils. So it's interpreting the Bible within that context. So that technically cannot be labeled sola scriptura. So it's more of a pseudo sola scriptura if we're just acknowledging the qualifications there. So we need to differentiate between the pseudo sola scriptura that Protestants use versus a true sola scriptura theology that we're going to be talking about. So another thing to keep in mind is that we're having these conversations within a historical context, and this historical context has been influenced by movements within Christian theology. So some significant movements are the fundamentalist movement that developed within the late 1800s as a reaction to the liberal Christian movement that developed after the Enlightenment. So after the Protestant Reformation, some time passed, another few decades, century or so, and then we have what is known as the Enlightenment, and people started rethinking the way they go about Christian theology, and we have a very different approach to Christian theology that is very different than historical Christianity, and because of that movement, people kind of tried to swing the pendulum back on the other side, and they created this fundamentalist movement that took a very strict approach to Scripture that is not compatible with Adventism, and yet somehow Adventists keep being kind of force-fit into that category, even though we have massive theological and presuppositional conflicts with that perspective. Another term here is inerrancy. So this idea that Scripture, in order to be able to be a trustworthy basis for theology, has to be inerrant without any kind of errors. And the typical question is, if we allow for errors in Scripture, who's to decide which parts are correct or which parts aren't correct? And then essentially the whole document becomes unusable because you don't know how to decide what parts are error and what aren't. And then you need an outside standard that's superior to Scripture to tell you which parts of Scripture are correct and which ones aren't. So another component of this thought process is a certain philosophical assumption that is built into historical Christian theology that God is timeless. And because he's timeless, he does not and cannot interact directly with individuals in time and space. So the way God has to communicate with people is by imprinting knowledge within the immortal soul of the individual. So basically, God has a certain message to give, and that message is entirely correct because it's coming from God, and it's imprinted on the soul of the prophet, and it ends up being transcribed to the pages, the manuscripts that the prophet writes, exactly the way God intends it to be, because this process is basically fully controlled by God and cannot produce error. This, of course, only applies to the original manuscripts, which incidentally we don't have access to, so it's kind of moot anyway, but at least within this fundamentalist and inerrantist perspective within Christianity, the original manuscripts are without error. Now, most of this stuff is not compatible with Adventism. Adventism takes a very different approach. We reject this concept of divine timelessness. We reject the idea of the immortal soul or any kind of immaterial soul. So the communication process here is very different within the Adventist approach to inspiration. And essentially, it doesn't really matter to our view whether even the original manuscripts had errors in them or not. So what is the alternative? The question we ask is, what is the logical necessity for sola scriptura? So if we had a spectrum where we said the Bible is 100% accurate and the Bible is 0% accurate on the other side, where do you need to draw the line and say this is the level of accuracy the Bible has to have in order to be able to do sola scriptura theology? And we insist that there is a certain threshold that you have to do sola scriptura theology, but it's nowhere near the 100% mark. In other words, you could have a certain limited amount of errors in Scripture and still do sola scriptura theology because those errors don't significantly affect the body of data that is scripture. So I call this the limited errancy approach. In terms of philosophical assumptions, we see God as eternally temporal as opposed to timeless. Human beings don't have this immaterial soul, so they function within time and space. They have certain limitations, historical limitations, and other limitations. And God has to communicate with humanity in a similar way that we communicate with each other, where there's plenty of room for people to make mistakes, to misunderstand, or to communicate things in a way that is unclear, or maybe incorporate some mistakes. What we do assume, so there is a presupposition we bring to scripture, and that assumption is that there is divine control over scripture that makes it possible to still hold on to a source scripture theology, but that control happens at the level of the canon and not at the level of the individual author. So essentially, I tend to always use this illustration. People today do a lot of work with data. So you could have a body of data and then use that data to draw a graph, for example. Now, if you take a certain body of data and you start to introduce errors, there's a certain amount of errors that you could introduce into that body of error that will not substantially affect the trajectory of the graph, because the graph follows the data trend and not the individual data points. So if some data points are off on the side, if you plot sufficient data, you could see what the trend is, and you could draw your graph based on the trend rather than the individual data. So as long as we have a complete set of data, which we do have in the canon itself, and I know there's some debates about the canon that I won't get into now, but even then it doesn't really matter, because we're using one particular canon and somebody can follow the same methodology with a different kind of canon. But once we have established our body of data, then it doesn't matter if that body of data contains some errors. As long as the majority of the data is correct, you can still develop your theology, and you don't need to rely on external sources because supposedly the data is erroneous, so you cannot trust it anymore. So it is possible to do source scriptural theology and reject inerrancy at the same time, and that is the approach to scripture that Adventists have taken. I want to quickly kind of give a side comment here. Even though we are building on this presupposition of divine control at the level of the canon, that's not the same as a presuppositional theology. All theology, regardless of what denomination or religion, it's always built on some presuppositions. But theology becomes presuppositional in nature when those presuppositions are set outside the realm of testability. So a person says, okay, I'm going to take these things for granted and they're beyond question, and I'm going to refuse to examine those elements, and then I'm going to build everything else from there. But if a person doesn't do that, all theological models out there build on some kind of presuppositions. And if somebody disagrees with me, you're more than welcome to give me an example of a theology that doesn't build on any kind of presuppositions. Okay, so moving on. And now, when it comes to the like how things happen in real life during the inspiration process. So God works with a prophet, right? The prophet has a certain limited understanding, and this applies both to a limited understanding of the world, because if you think back in history, we're going as far back as 3,000 years. People 3,000 years ago had a much more limited understanding of the world around them than we do today. They didn't even know they were on a planet in space. They didn't understand the solar system, things like that. There's many things that they didn't understand at that point in history. So they had a limited understanding of the world around them, but they also had a limited understanding of the plan of salvation, because they didn't know, for example, that God was going to send His Son to die for us. At least the majority of them didn't. So there's a lot that people at that point in time did not have as part of their understanding of reality. So when God communicated with them, He had to adapt His message to their understanding. And He had to make it make sense to them, because He wasn't controlling the process by which information came from God to their minds and then onto the piece of paper where it was written. The people had to hear the message, process it, understand it, and then communicate it within their own words. And without controlling this, God had to take into account the limitations of the human agent. And not just this, but usually the prophet wasn't just writing things down for themselves, but they were writing them down for a community, and he had to take into account the ability of that community to understand the message as well. So there's a lot of room for misunderstandings, for mistakes, for errors to come in here between God giving the message and the message being put on the page. And then, of course, there's additional room for mistakes coming in the future in terms of copy errors and all those other things. But in spite of this, this is still superior to any kind of human speculation, of human reasoning or contemplation and things like that. So, for example, somebody 3,000 years ago sitting there and trying to think about reality, trying to think about God, trying to think about the world, whatever they would come up with using the limited information they had would inherently be inferior to somebody being directly communicated to by God through this revelation process. So, yes, there is a possibility of error within the inspiration process that exists in our understanding of revelation as compared to other Christians, but this process is still vastly superior to anything people could have come up with on their own. So the differentiation between the prophet and the regular person still exists. Okay, so given that this errors exist, or the possibility of errors exist in this process here, the inspiration process, there's an additional process of selection that takes place before things become part of Scripture. So first of all, out of all the people that were part of, the God's chosen people, out of Israel, for example, or other people that God has worked with, only a select few of them were actually considered prophets. So God didn't communicate with everybody. He handpicked the people that he used to communicate with his community. Out of all the messages that God gave these prophets, only some of them were written down. So prophets had messages for the people that they did not necessarily always take the time to write down. And out of all that was written down, only some of it became canonical. So if we were to draw a big circle here for all the people that were part of God's people, then you have a smaller circle inside that represented the prophets, and then you had an even smaller circle that represented the written material, and a very, very small circle within that represented the canonical written material. So there's quite a bit of a selection process here. And this process is affected by numerous things as we look over the history of the development of the canon. So the first books of scriptural writing, like people like Moses and others that wrote the first all those books of the Bible, they created a trajectory that other future prophets were to follow within. So basically, if there were truly the people of God, they would continue on in the same trajectory that was started, initiated by the earlier prophets. And as prophetic writings were collected over time, there was a subsequent selection process, because for whatever reason, we didn't have, not all of the people's writings were kept. Now, this could be because these things were lost to history. I mean, maybe a prophet wrote something down, and in the process, the book was destroyed, it was damaged, it was lost somewhere. But what we're saying is that above all this, that God is overseeing the process and making sure that the things he wants to keep and preserve in Scripture are preserved, and the things that he doesn't want to keep within the canon of Scripture somehow don't make it. So whether this process was just things were lost or things were damaged or whatever, or whether future prophets were guided by God to reevaluate the collection of sacred books and say, okay, these are the books we're going to keep as sacred from a wider collection of books that we have available. Whatever that process was, there was some kind of selection process, because evidently we don't have access to all those writings, even writings written by actual prophets. Okay, then we come to the time of Christ. So Christ is pointed forward to by all of previous history. So biblical history up to the point of Christ anticipates the coming of the Messiah. And then Christ comes, his ministry is endorsed by the miracles. He performs his ministry is endorsed by his resurrection. He points backwards towards the Old Testament and endorses the collection of texts that form the Old Testament writings. And then he endorses the ministry of the apostles after him. So he has an endorsement for himself, an endorsement for the past, and an endorsement for the future. And then the apostles who have been endorsed by Christ, they oversee the completion of the canon, and then the canon is closed after that generation of people that had been with Christ. And that becomes the canon as a whole. So there's this sort of mutual endorsement back and forth between all these entities that create what we have today as the canonical writings. We know, even for example, the Apostle Paul mentions that he wrote letters to the Corinthians and others that we don't have today. So somehow within this whole process, those things were lost. And we know that God oversaw the process, or the assumption we're bringing to this is that God oversaw the process such that the things that we have in the canon are the things that God intended for us to have there, to provide us with the body of data based on which to develop our theology. So by that very process, a regular prophet, even though a true prophet, has lesser authority than a prophet whose writings made it into the canon. So the canonical writings have a higher level of authority than any other kind of prophetic writings. And then these become the sole basis of theology. So when we come to scripture, we understand that the possibility of errors exists. We understand that there's a specific selective process that sets these writings apart from any other writings, and that in spite of these errors, there's sufficient data incorporated in this body of text for us to work out our theology in spite of those errors. And we don't have to presume that there is some kind of inerrancy involved in the process. Okay, so when it comes to Ellen White, then, given that we already have a view of inspiration that allows for errors to come into this process, the limited amount of errors, and given that Ellen White did not receive that additional level of scrutiny that the canonical writers received, where out of all the different texts that they've written, God selected only a specific few that made it into the canon and that were meant to form the basis of theology. We have to understand that puts her in a different role compared to other prophets in the past that did make it into canonical writings. So in contrast with the Bible, with Ellen White, we have all her writings, including even simple things like a letter she wrote to her kids or her husband or different friends, where she wasn't even trying to exercise some kind of prophetic authority. She was just communicating like every other person is communicating. In order for Ellen White to have the same level of scrutiny that the biblical writers had, we would have to come back in 1,000 years, for example, and take all her writings and somehow have the majority of them lost to history, and only a select few, and then say, okay, these are the ones that God preserved because he intends these to be a basis of theology. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that's how we should think about it, but that's the kind of thing that would have to happen to Ellen White's writings to be similar to the kind of thing that happened to the prophets in the Bible that gave those select writings a higher level of authority and that made them a trustworthy basis for our theology. And we don't have that with Ellen White because we have everything she's ever written. We don't have that kind of scrutiny applied with the writings. And the reason we don't is because God doesn't intend us to rely on her writings for our theological process. So when it comes to theology, the Bible is the basis on which we are meant to build our theology. Now, I mentioned that other Christians try to do sola scriptura, but what they're doing when they're doing sola scriptura is something very different than using the Bible and the Bible alone in their theology. And I've argued many times that Adventists are the only ones that have a working methodology for doing theology of the Bible alone. because even though there are other groups like fundamentalist groups or conservative evangelical groups, or even some historic Anabaptists that have tried to do theology with the Bible alone, they never actually developed a methodology that works and that makes sense. And we actually do have something. I have several videos on the Adventist theological method, but we have a way to do theology with the Bible alone, and that is the thing that sets us apart from other Christian groups. Now, unfortunately, within the Adventist Church, somehow we um, made never quite made sense of this within our own way of thinking as a community, because we have so many people that have been influenced by a fundamentalist mentality to the point where a large section of Adventists, um, they cannot in their mind separate Ellen White from their thought process. Their entire way of thinking, their entire epistemology, their entire approach to theological knowledge is deeply rooted in Ellen White. And they don't know how to differentiate Ellen White from scripture in their mind. They just kind of, the Ellen White and scripture kind of overlap each other, and they cannot separate the two. And because of this, we end up continuing to have problems with Ellen White in the church that we don't need to have, just because people haven't taken the time to work through their theology with the Bible alone and understand why our theology is based on the Bible alone. In other words, we don't need anything from Ellen White to have a complete Adventist theology that is still fully Adventist. We can do all of it entirely with the Bible alone. And in fact, we're the only ones that can do that with the Bible alone. We're the only ones that can build a theology that's built entirely on the Bible alone. Now, that's probably the largest segment of Adventists who are like the more fundamentalist minded Adventists who depend heavily on avoiding the theology. But then even within more educated circles, like even at Andrews, we have a probably quite a segment of people being trained to think about Ellen White in a slightly different way. They don't treat her as a component of their epistemology to the same extent as the fundamentalist Adventists, but they see Ellen White as the expression that's been used is prima traditionis. Basically, if you look at other Christian denominations, like Lutherans, Methodists, Calvinists, they usually have some key figure that has had a major impact on their theology, like maybe Luther, Melanchthon, Calvin, Wesley, and other people like that. And those people have had a guiding role in their approach to theology. And some of our scholars have argued that, well, why can't we do the same thing with Ellen White that they're doing with some of these other people? And that is really a bad approach to this thing, because first of all, Ellen White cannot be compared to those other people because she crosses the line into that role of a prophet. And once that happens, the dynamics are very different. So we couldn't do that even if we wanted to. But why would we want to, considering they have no choice but to do that with their theology, because their theology is not based on the Bible alone, and it needs certain additional components. Well, we do have a mechanism to do theology with the Bible alone. So we don't need to incorporate Ellen White into our process, even as maybe a lesser role than the fundamentalist Adventists have. Even there, we don't need her. And then there's like people on the more liberal side of the church who have this view of theology that's communitarian. And I won't get into what this means here for people that don't know, but for those that are familiar with the term, certain segments of the church view all theology as communitarian. That's something that people develop within community, and everybody has their own community, and they develop their theology that way. And because Ellen White is such a significant part of our community, then she needs to be incorporated into our theological process. And all this approaches, all they do is they continue to propagate the problems we have as a denomination with Ellen White, when they're not necessary. We don't need to have any of these things. We can come back and build our theology with the Bible alone. Adventist theology stands and falls on Scripture alone. And when we take that approach, that frees us from dependence on Ellen White. We essentially don't need her within our theological process. And we could, like, even if you came to the point where we made a decision, or we came to the conclusion that Ellen White was a false prophet, it wouldn't matter because our theology stands on its own. It has its basis in scripture, and it doesn't need anything external besides scripture, and is self-sufficient in that sense. Now, I want to quickly mention something here because, of course, there's been a lot of controversy on that point as well. So a lot of critics of Adventism have argued that no, our theology doesn't add up and all these things. And I would argue that even the process these critics have been following is not valid, because they come against Adventism as if there's some external standard to compare us by. But the reality is that there's many different perspectives within the world, the Christian world at large. And who exactly are they comparing us to? Which of the various Christian traditions are they judging us by? What somebody will need to do is they will need to say, okay, here's all the different major Christian traditions, and here's a list of all the ones that reach some level of viability. There has to be some kind of threshold of viability where we say, okay, any Christian tradition that goes above this threshold is viable. It's a reasonable tradition. You know, it makes sense. It's internally coherent and all that. And all the ones that don't reach that threshold are not. And then somehow within this context, evaluate whether Adventism meets this threshold or not. Nobody has really gone through this process in evaluating Adventism, if they even had understood Adventism, which most of the critics so far that I've come across mostly strawman the Adventist theology. They don't really have a good understanding of how it works. But again, before anybody can question Adventist theology, they have to put it side by side with a series of other approaches to theology that are workable, and show that somehow we don't meet that standard. And if they're not doing this, all they're really saying is that out of probably hundreds of thousands of different Christian perspectives out there, they picked one, and somehow their perspective is the only right one, and everybody else is wrong. Well, their problem is not with Adventism, then, is with everybody except that one perspective. So the very approach that people use to criticize our theology is bad. Okay, so that being said, I would say that the real question for Adventists is, does our theology stand on the scripture alone? And as far as I'm concerned, this element is solid. Like, our theology is solid, and is solidly stable on the scripture. And because of that, we're not in any way dependent on Ellen White. We're in the exact same position theologically, whether or not Ellen White had ever Ellen White was in the picture at all or not. We can complete this semester and still be in the same position theologically. And once we establish ourselves theologically on scripture, then we're free to do with Ellen White whatever we need to do without feeling like our position is being threatened in any way. And what happens once we do that? Then we can actually secure even Ellen White's role within the Adventist tradition, because she played a major role in helping us come to the point where we developed this theology that stands on the Bible alone. She helped us to understand how all these things, all the pieces come together. She had a significant role in bringing us to where we are today, where we can actually have this position that is stable and solid on scripture. And she had a massive part to play in the development of our community, in organizing this church, in making it a global phenomenon and things like that. So instead of the Adventist perspective needing Ellen White in order to establish itself, it's actually the other way around. We're established on scripture, and because we're established on scripture, Ellen White's role within this process is established as well. And once we secure ourselves on scripture, then we don't have to really worry about anything necessarily concerning Ellen White and her role and the contribution she made to Adventism. And because we can approach things from a position of strength, as opposed to this position where we always feel threatened and we got to make sure that we protect Ellen White, or else our entire theoretical structure falls apart. No, we're coming from a position of strength. Our structure is solid, is established, our theology is established on scripture. It doesn't need anything else, it's not dependent on anything else. Then we can just face the facts, face reality when it comes to Ellen White, whatever that might mean. So if there's any situation where we need to make corrections in the writings, there's nothing to lose there because that's not the basis of who we are as a community. If we need to issue apologies somewhere because maybe she did certain things that maybe she should have known better, but she didn't, or however it happened, she copied somebody's writing, she should have given credit to them, but she didn't. If we need to issue some apology, that's fine. There's no loss to the church because we're already stable in our positioning. And another thing that we need to do most likely is to take advantage of modern technology to go through everything she's written, compare it to everything else that she's written, and if there's anything else that has been written, and if there's any material that has been copied from somebody else, then we need to just insert quotation marks in there and attribute those quotes to whatever the sources were from where that material came. So at this point in time, because people have an unsound view of revelation and inspiration, doing this kind of stuff makes people feel that it's putting the church in jeopardy, because what is everybody going to think if we admit that Ellen White did this, or she said that, or she copied this, or whatever. But once we establish ourselves on a sound foundation, on a sound theology of revelation and inspiration, then none of that matters anymore because our position is secure and we can actually do whatever we need to do if there's any point to this. So if it means, and I know some people claim that this has already been done. I think somebody hired a plagiarism lawyer that went through our writings. I've heard different reports on that, and honestly, like I'm not really concerned with who's correct on this. But if that needs to be done again more accurately, if it hasn't been done correctly, then let it be done again. Whatever needs to be done, all these things can be done freely now because we're not so dependent on her to where it's gonna affect our whole view of ourselves if some changes or corrections or anything like that needs to be made. So anyway, I think when it comes to Ellen White, the issues really are how we think about Adventist theology as a whole, how we think about revelation and inspiration. And once we solve those things, everything else sort of falls into place. And we need to deal with these things because otherwise we're just, decades on end, we're going to keep having issues with people coming up and saying, well, Ellen White did this or she said that, and so on. And then we're going to have to keep dealing with those issues that we just don't need to actually address because we can address them once and for all and be done with them. So anyway, that's kind of how I see this question of Ellen White and Adventism.